All right, well, what will come as frustration for many people are rail strikes that will commence tomorrow. There'll be widespread travel disruption as railway workers hold strikes over pay and jobs this week. The action will affect train lines across England, Scotland and Wales. You can look here at the timings over the next 3 days and the services that are going to be affected. If you look at this map here, it shows the lines that are running across the country, but you can see vast swathes of the UK will be without rail services across those 3 days. Now, Keir Starmer, the Labour leader, has accused ministers of failing to engage with unions and wanting the country to grind to a halt so they can feed off the division. And the Transport Secretary, Grant Shapps, you saw in the headlines there, has written to Keir Starmer calling on him to personally condemn the strikes. And is this blame game helping us get closer to a resolution?
Well, I think we're not particularly close to a resolution, but I think there's an awful lot of silly rhetoric. I mean, for anybody to suggest that any government, let alone one under the pressures that this one is under, wants to damage the economy at a time when we've got rampant inflation and huge problems, is just in cloud cuckoo land. And I don't think that the Labour people who are saying that even really believe it. But where I think Grant Shapps is right is to challenge Keir Starmer because he has resolutely refused to condemn strikes, which are going to cause massive disruption, damage the economy, and probably also cause a lot of suffering. I mean, some people can only get to hospital appointments on public transport.
All right, well, let's put that to Sarah. Is it complete nonsense having Labour ministers say that the government would actually like these strikes to go ahead? And will Keir Starmer personally condemn them?
So what's nonsense is the idea that the government can't help resolve this issue. Nobody wants the strikes. Keir Starmer doesn't want the strikes. No. I don't want the strikes. Nobody wants the strikes. The question is, what do we do to try and avert them? Now, the government has refused to get involved in the negotiation. That is wrong. They could have real clout. When we had problems with Liberty Steel, did Kwasi Kwarteng say, no, I'm not going to meet the trade unions? Of course he didn't. He got in the mix and did what he needed to do. Now, Network Rail is a public company. It's owned by the government, by the taxpayer, so much so that the government are winding it up next year and turning it into something else. So they have complete control over Network Rail, and the rail operating companies have not been given any mandate from the government. They need that power from the government to negotiate. So unless the government gets involved, Grant Shapps should spend less time writing letters to Keir Starmer and more time trying to fix the problem so that we all don't have the disruption that we might see coming otherwise.
I mean, is Sarah right, John? The government can't wash its hands of this. It can't say it doesn't have any involvement.
Well, I think that it's ridiculous to say that the government is looking forward to this with any kind of, licking its lips or anything like that.
But they could get involved.
But I agree with you that there is a limited role for government, but not a big one for an awful lot of this stuff, because an awful lot of it is with train operating companies. But I think it's just really, really weird to think that people are looking forward to this with any degree of relish on either side. It's just silly.
Right. Well, what about a resolution? Why isn't the government getting involved?
No, the government needs to be really careful, because what's happening here is that people are trying to drag government ministers into the middle of this negotiation because of all this political blame game that's going on, which is what you've just described right at the top of this. And the unions would love nothing more than to have the government right in the middle of it. The government shouldn't be in the middle of it, but they should be playing a role around the edges if they can possibly help. But if they get dragged into the middle, that just politicises it. It makes the megaphone diplomacy that we're seeing at the moment even worse.
But it is politicised because the government have said
to
Network Rail and to the rail operating companies, I mean politicised in its broadest sense, the government have said to Network Rail and the rail operating companies, you need to cut by 10%. So we have seen already thousands and thousands of cuts to services, but we're now looking at some issues which may interrupt the security, the safety of the passengers and the staff who are on those trains. So of course the government has a role to play. They can't say, make 10% cuts. We're not going to give you a negotiating mandate, but there's nothing we can do, because that's simply wrong. Of course they can follow do what Kwasi did. Get involved, come to a resolution.
But the taxpayer has stumped up billions, absolutely billions, during the course of the pandemic to keep the railways going, I think it's perfectly reasonable that the taxpayer then is allowed to say, look, normally we don't have to subsidise the railways to anything like this amount, and that's not a sustainable long-term answer. That's a perfectly reasonable thing for taxpayers to be saying.
Why are the Welsh government able to do it?
You know, across the world, governments are subsidising their public transport system. And, you know, I do think the government's at the centre of this, because if you go to the root cause, £4 billion worth of cuts to our railways, £4 billion to our railways and Transport for London, that is the thing that has catalysed this, and this is the thing that has brought it to a head. And for me, that seems completely mad when actually, against the context of cost of living, when you look at Germany, they're putting more subsidies so that people can travel across public transport for €9 a month, and you've got net zero. So why we are cutting when we should be investing makes no sense. And if you come back to this, what are they striking about?
Right.
It's about safety. We are about to
pay.
Safety and pay. But let's take the question of safety. We're about to see 600,000 cuts to maintenance hours.
Well, let's have a look at pay, Miatta, because I've been conscious, listening to many interviews about this, that no one talks about the figures involved in terms of what's being asked for by the unions, which would be an inflation-busting pay rise. It could go up to 10-11% by the end of this year. That's a large number. I don't know what John thinks the number should be in terms of a pay rise, or at all, or what Sarah thinks it should be. What do you think it should be?
Well, so they are right to ask for, to compensate for cost of living, and then there's a negotiation.
Cost of living, okay.
And then there's always a negotiation. But, you know, let's take the question of pay against the context where we have seen huge stagnation in wages.
I've seen you,
against the context in which we're seeing a huge hike in cost of living, it's not unreasonable for them to ask for increases in pay.
All right.
And for me, that is the thing that the government should be sitting around the table in order to try and come to a resolution. Because at the end of it is a question of public investment and the decision by the government to cut.
And what's wrong with that?
What is wrong with that is that we're going back to the inflationary spiral, which those of us who lived through the 70s were very, very familiar with, whereby there is a rise in the cost of living, and therefore people want their wages to go up to, and I quote your contributor, compensate for it. That is the one thing we mustn't do. Whatever level the pay rise is at, it's got to be below inflation, below the... No, let me get through this. Below the rises in cost of living for this reason, that if they bust inflation or even get very close to that level, then what happens is prices go up in order to meet those wages. And because prices go up, there's then a demand for higher wages. That is the spiral that it is the government's duty to resist.
So there is no evidence that we're seeing a wage inflation spiral. We've seen that actually regular wages are down by 2.2% in real terms. That phenomenon is not playing out. And I think against the context where people are seeing huge squeezing, it is right. What I don't understand is that since the pandemic, train operators have taken about £500 million of profits from the taxpayer. Why is the government not saying we're going to cap your profits? Why are they asking the workers to bear the brunt of this? There is always a choice there. And my view is that against the context where people are feeling a massive squeeze, we shouldn't be asking workers to take the hit.
Anne?
Everybody has got to be asked to take a hit, not the hit. But what I do dispute very strongly was your opening sentence where you said, well, there's no evidence of the spiral yet. No, this is the beginning. And if the rail workers are successful in getting an inflation-busting pay rise, other unions will very naturally want the same thing. And it is to prevent that spiral that I'm saying it's the government's duty to resist inflation-busting pay rises, to prevent that spiral.
All right. Well, Sarah, where would you put the pay rise at?
Well, firstly, this kind of tone of, you know, the government has a duty to do X, Y and Z. Of course, the government has duty to do lots of things, but this government has just wasted £11 billion on COVID fraud.
But hang on.
They've wasted billions on PPE that's literally been burnt. I mean, they are not being careful with public money.
All right, so do you think they should get 11% if that's where inflation is going?
Each of our sectors have different ways of negotiating pay increases.
So for
the RMT are absolutely right to ask for a reasonable pay rise,
Which
and there needs to be...
But what is that, Sarah?
I do not have a figure.
If you were negotiating, what would you put it at? If they've been offered 3% and 11% is the level of inflation by the end of the year, be honest, and I'm going to do the same with John, where should the pay rise be?
I do not have a figure. Right. What I would say is that because this rail negotiation is about safety, it's about lines, it's about money, it's about wages, it's about a lot of things. But they are right. As Miatta said, they're absolutely reasonable to ask for a pay rise. Now, the point is the government should have seen this coming. We knew a year ago, 2 years ago, well, for 12 years we've had wage stagnation, but we knew that these problems were coming. We said have emergency budgets to tackle the cost of living crisis, do things to help people now with the bills that they face, get the economy moving in the long run, sort out our energy crisis so we're making our own energy and using our own supplies, and make sure we've got a proper economy that's fit for the future so that we can move much faster and get the economy growing, and so people will automatically then, the issues of inflation go down and people can have decent pay.
Well, that's what Sarah says Labour would do and thinks the government should do the same. What figure would you give the RMT?
Well, my point is that I don't think ministers should be dragged into the middle of this. I don't think the government should have a...
So you won't have a resolution?
No,
so you're just going to leave it and we could have more strikes?
No, you can have a resolution. I think it's absolutely right that everybody should strain every sinew. But I don't think...
have a resolution because the government haven't given them a mandate.
The unions want this desperately to be a direct negotiation in a sort of 1970s awful style between unions and government ministers.
I understand that.
That's a trap we must not fall into.
Do you think the RMT and do you think railway workers deserve a pay rise that's above 3%?
I think that everybody deserves and needs a pay rise given what's going on with inflation. But I think that if you start to say the government must nominate a figure, you achieve what the rail unions want, which is to drag ministers into the middle of what should be a commercial conversation.
Right, let's move on.